Did you know that Harvey Weinstein, that Hollywood movie producer who also sexually victimized and raped women, and now he's serving time in prison for it? Did you hear that he was diagnosed with COVID-19? Could it be that this whole pandemic, the whole point of it was to punish Harvey Weinstein for his sins? Did you know that 2 weeks after New Orleans celebrated Mardi Gras, that there was a surge in cases of COVID-19 in the city? Could it have been that this whole COVID-19 deal was really a matter of God punishing New Orleans for the city's indulgent sins? Have you heard Christians or other people generally speculate that maybe COVID-19, this pandemic, is God's general judgment upon the human population for sin, evil, wickedness? What are we supposed to make of these kinds of claims that God punishes people through a pandemic like COVID-19? I want to offer a reflection on that very question, but hopefully by offering some clarity on the concept of punishment and what it would mean to punish a person rightly, and then use that as a grid to go back and evaluate these claims. And of course, by implication, I'm going to be suggesting another way perhaps to evaluate or to think about all the cases in which God is described as punishing people in Scripture, such as through droughts or pestilence or disease, floods, volcanic explosions, and the like. So to get started, let's start off with a definition of the word punishment. What do we mean when we talk about somebody being punished? I'm going to offer the following definition of punishment. I'm going to call it the act of imparting a penalty to an individual or individuals for an offense committed. So to punish someone is to impart a penalty on them for an offense that they have committed. Now, beyond that, I think that punishment properly, for it to be undertaken in a proper way, there are 3 criteria that must be met. The first criterion I'm going to suggest is that the punishment must discriminate. In other words, it cannot just wantonly affect an entire group or population where there's a mixture of individuals who are guilty and others who are not properly guilty. For that punishment to be a proper punishment for a particular act or a sin, it must discriminate between those that are guilty and those that are innocent. If 5 people are all mixed together in a room and you know that only one of them is guilty for having taken something from you, it doesn't make any sense to punish all of the people, right? You just punish the person who committed the crime. So that's the first point, that punishment must discriminate properly to be proper punishment. And the second thing is that punishment must be unambiguous. Specifically, the connection between the offense committed and the penalty being imposed for the offense must be clear. Let's say that you pour coffee on my computer. Next week, I see you and I decide that I'm going to impart a penalty. And so I walk up behind you and I smack you upside the head. And then I walk away. If you're not clear why I smacked you upside the head, then that is not an appropriate punishment. It would only be an appropriate punishment, if it could be at all, if I was unambiguous, if I made it clear, hey, you broke my computer, I'm going to smack you, and then I smacked you. So the second point then is punishment must not only discriminate, select between guilty and innocent parties relative to the offense committed, it must also be unambiguous. It must select out and make clear to the parties that are being punished that they are being punished for the offense. If it's ambiguous, if they have no idea why they are suffering or why you've inflicted some pain upon them, it's not a proper punishment. The third point I'm going to suggest is that punishment must be proportional. So if you bump into me in the hallway, it's inappropriate for me to kill your dog, because bumping does not properly warrant killing your dog as a retributive act. So the punishment must be commensurate with the offense committed. And only if you have these 3 points, that the penalty imposed for an offense is discriminate between the guilty and innocent parties, or not guilty parties, that it is unambiguous, that it is made clear to the parties who are punished that they're being punished, and that it's proportional, that it is a proper punishment or penalty relative to the offense committed. Only in all those circumstances would you have a proper punishment. Now, we're going to talk about God for a second, because now we're going to talk about, well, God punishing people. The first thing we want to say is when we talk about God, what we're talking about is a being who has the following qualities. Okay? God is all-powerful or omnipotent. God is all-knowing or omniscient. God is all-wise or omniprudent. And God is, let's see, all-powerful, all-wise, all good or omnibenevolent. So again, God's omnipotent, omniscient, omniprudent, and omnibenevolent. Now, any being with those qualities, right? Omniscient, all powerful, all knowing, all wise, and all good. Any being with all those qualities, if that being exercises punishment on another agent, it follows necessarily that the punishment exercised will not be an inept punishment. Rather, it will be one in which the penalty is discriminate between guilty and innocent parties, that it is opposed in a way that is unambiguous, so that it is clear one is being punished, and that it is proportional, right? That it is, the punishment imposed is clear relative to the offense committed. With all that in mind, now let's return to the question of whether COVID-19 could be God's punishment on the human population, or on New Orleans, or on Harvey Weinstein. The obvious problem here is, first of all, that COVID-19 does not, in any discernible sense at least, discriminate between any obviously guilty party and any innocent party. It tends to hit older people, the elderly, at a higher rate than younger people, but it also tends to get people with pre-existing conditions. Let's say they've already suffered a respiratory illness, they may be more likely to get it. It also hits, in some exceptional cases, young adults, millennials, Gen Z, even teenagers or children can succumb to COVID-19. So there is no obvious sense in which it discriminates. And of course, that is the case generally with pandemics, right? They don't discriminate between guilty and innocent parties. Second problem is that as a punishment, this is completely ambiguous, right? It's punishment for what? And the very fact that nobody's clear makes it a problem, a very clear problem, that it is not an effective punishment. If you don't know what you're being punished for, it cannot be an effective punishment. And finally, proportionality. Well, of course, it's a little difficult to address this issue because it's not clear what one could possibly be punished for in the first place. But I think it's also pretty clear that COVID-19 can be certainly for a death, it can be a terrible way to die. And even if you were, let's say somebody committed a capital offense and that you believe in capital punishment, presumably the way that you were going to go about that capital punishment is in the most humane way possible, which would be to minimize the suffering of the person being punished. If you sought rather to extend the suffering of the person being punished in capital punishment over several days, that would be considered cruel and unusual. And if a person is being punished by suffering from COVID-19, by any standard definition, I think that would qualify as cruel and unusual punishment, that they're slowly suffering, they can't breathe, they're struggling for their next breath as they have all these aches and pains and agonies in their body, and they slowly succumb over days and days to this illness. That would be cruel and unusual, it's not proportional. So it seems to me that at every point, the idea that COVID-19 is a punishment for particular sins faces critical difficulties. Now, in order to avoid cognitive dissonance, I think Christians have to be willing then to ask some hard questions. And they are hard questions about how we should then think about descriptions of punishment in the Bible, when it is described that God punishes an entire population by drowning people or by subjecting people to drought. or pestilence on their crops. Because in all those cases, first of all, it doesn't seem like there is a clear discrimination of guilty to innocent parties. And just to see one clear example of this, if you think about the Exodus from Egypt, and of course the last greatest terrible punishment upon Egypt, which you could very well interpret as a sort of natural punishment through a natural evil, because we really don't know what this angel of the Lord was doing and how this came about. But what he did do was to kill the firstborn of every family of Egypt, from the Pharaoh, the wealthy, powerful Pharaoh who was keeping the Israelites in slavery, down to the firstborn son of the poverty-stricken Egyptian peasant living, eking out an existence on the banks of the Nile River. Everybody lost their firstborn son. It did not discriminate. And in fact, in the 4th century, Gregory of Nyssa, a famous theologian, raised a key moral objection to the traditional straightforward reading of the killing of the firstborn of the Egyptians for precisely that reason, that it didn't discriminate, and he didn't think that was just. I think that he was applying there some of these intuitive principles about correct, just punishment. The punishment in terms of unambiguity or clarity, you could say that it's clear or unambiguous. So people sort of look back at the biblical judgments and say, okay, but clearly there was a prophet here telling everybody what to think. Well, it's tough to know that that is in fact the case. See, what we have is a collection in the Old Testament and the New Testament, particularly the Old Testament, of course, of various prophets issuing various warnings about impending judgments or providing an interpretation of an ongoing judgment. The thing that we have to keep in mind, however, is that it's not at all obvious that everybody who is being subjected to this suffering, be it the suffering of a drought or of a blight or pestilence or a flood or something else, there's no evidence that every one of those individuals who is being subjected to it, presumably as punishment, that they understood it as such. So it's not clear that it was unambiguous to every individual. What you have is a record of a prophet at some time relative to the event making a pronouncement. It's not clear that that pronouncement was ever clearly communicated to every individual who suffered, and thus you have the problem of ambiguity. In the same way today, if God were to send a prophet, and this prophet, let's say, is living in rural Montana, and he has issued some declarations that COVID-19 is God's punishment, what illumination does that provide to a person living in Wuhan or in Venice, Italy, who has never heard of this and yet suffered the same punishment? So it has the problem of the ambiguity. And finally, again, the question, the problem of proportionality. So this one I think is pretty straightforward. Again, you have in the biblical, everybody drowns, infants drown, young people drown, and adults and everybody collectively they drown, or everybody's starving, or everybody is suffering from, apparently the volcanic explosion of a place like Sodom is often speculated, or earthquakes, or the various things that could happen to a person in a natural event. They're all suffering, and there doesn't seem to be any proportionality of the punishment interpreted as such to the crimes attributed to specific individuals. So for all these reasons, I think that there's a lot of tension there. And the challenge for the Christian then is to think, if there are conceptual problems with thinking that God is punishing people today through a pestilence like COVID-19, then we have to think, well, does that mean either that we revise our understanding of punishment, which is possible, right? You could say, okay, the analysis that Randall has provided of punishment is incorrect, and I'm in fact going to use these biblical narratives as a way to revise my understanding of punishment. That's perfectly fine. You could do that. Another thing you could do is you could say, I think that Randall basically got his analysis of punishment correct, and I'm going to use that as a basis to now go and revisit these texts and look at other ways to interpret what's going on in these texts. For example, another way to think about them could be that they reflect a manner of what we call accommodation. So it's not that God perhaps was punishing people in the way that is interpreted, but rather in the ancient world, they didn't have a conception of nature with natural laws that operate independently of God's direct volitional action upon them. And so you read a passage like Psalm 104, and it talks about natural processes, even like the flow of water, not explicable in terms of hydrological laws, but rather explicable in terms of the immediate will, the immediate divine will, acting upon water, making it flow on a particular course. So they had a different understanding of nature. In fact, whether they had an understanding of nature as we would understand it today is very doubtful. And you could say then, well, then perhaps what is going on is God accommodated to the understanding of ancient Near Eastern people in order to bring his revelation to them. And that involved him speaking to them in categories they understood, including the direct, volitional, and sometimes punitive action of the deity, in this case of Yahweh, upon human populations. But perhaps that wasn't correct. Perhaps that was God's accommodation and he's bringing them through to a fuller revelation and understanding of who he is. So that's another possibility. What I don't think that we can do is what I think many Christians, in fact, do, which is to live in an uncomfortable cognitive dissonance in which they have a general conception of punishment, much like my conceptual analysis that I provided here, and yet they also affirm simultaneously that God randomly punished people through droughts and floods and so on in the ancient Near Eastern world. That they never try to draw those two issues, those two different perspectives together, and they just exist in an uneasy cognitive dissonance, is I think what many people end up concluding. So for me, I'm actually not going to tell you whether God is judging human populations through COVID-19. If you have a particular understanding of Hebrew scripture, the Old Testament and the Bible generally, then I think you have to remain open to the possibility that he is doing it. But if you look for alternative readings, then you may be able to say more definitively that in fact God is not doing it. And it's up to each one of us to work out our theology in a way that is consistent, coherent, faithful to scripture and to theological tradition, and I think livable and something that we can embrace.